You're noticing it without trying to. Not as a thought, more like a quiet mismatch. Something you used to lean toward doesn't land the same way anymore, and it's not disappointing, just neutral. You're not pulling away. You're not rejecting anything. It's more like the signal didn't reach you because you weren't standing where you used to stand, and you felt that. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Just a subtle pause inside where something didn't echo back the way it once did. This isn't about losing interest. It's about noticing where attention no longer sticks. And that's why this feels relevant now, because a lot of people are still reacting to something you're no longer reacting to, still responding to messages that don't quite register for you anymore. Not better, not worse. Just not yours. You may have noticed it in moments of silence. When you're scrolling, listening, observing, that sense that something is being said, but it isn't speaking to you. Not because it's wrong, but because it's arriving at a version of you that doesn't quite exist anymore. You didn't announce that change. You didn't plan it. It just happened quietly, somewhere between waiting and not needing to wait anymore. Between paying attention and not needing to lean in. There's been more space lately, not emptiness. Space, and space changes how things land. Some ideas that once felt activating now feel repetitive. Some voices that once felt important now feel distant, but not irrelevant. You don't feel above them. You don't feel separate, you just feel elsewhere. And what's strange is how calm that feels. No urgency to explain it, no need to define it. Just a soft awareness that you're not standing where you used to stand. Around this point, many people assume they're missing something, that they've fallen out of sync, that they should re-engage, retune, re-enter. But that's not the sensation you're having. It's not lack. It's completion, not a dramatic ending, a quiet one. Like finishing a sentence internally and noticing the room didn't need to hear it. You may have felt this while listening to something that once felt profound, and now it feels familiar, not shallow. Not false, just already absorbed, already lived through. And that's when the subtle question arises, not consciously, but internally. If this isn't landing anymore, what changed? Not what did I do wrong? Not what do I need next? Just what moved? And the answer doesn't arrive as words. It arrives as stillness, as a sense that you're no longer waiting for something to happen to you, that whatever you were leaning toward already folded into you. You didn't receive it, you integrated it, and now you're noticing the after effect. This is usually where people feel tempted to explain it, to name it, to frame it as growth or awakening or detachment. But none of those words fit the actual experience, because this isn't about becoming something new. It's about no longer needing to receive certain things externally. Around the 3-minute mark, this is where many people suddenly realize why some messages feel like they're speaking past them. Not because the message changed, but because the listener did, and the listener didn't move forward. They moved inward, quietly, without ceremony. You may have noticed how your reactions have softened, not because you're suppressing them, but because they don't hook the same way. Things still happen. You still notice, but the pull isn't there. The urgency to respond, to align, to agree, to oppose, it doesn't activate automatically anymore. There's more observing, more space between stimulus and identity. And it doesn't feel like discipline. It feels natural, like you're standing slightly behind yourself, watching life move without needing to step in every time. This isn't disengagement, it's alignment without effort. And that's why it's subtle. Because nothing looks different on the outside. You still live your life. You still make choices. You still feel emotions. But there's a layer that's no longer asking for permission from external signals. You're not waiting for validation, not seeking confirmation, not even seeking clarity. Because clarity isn't something you're reaching for anymore. It's something that settles on its own. And when that happens, some signals simply don't reach you. Not because they're blocked, because there's no surface left for them to land on. Here's a gentle reorientation you may recognize. You're not confused, you're unhooked. That distinction matters. Confusion feels noisy, This feels quiet, and quiet isn't empty. Quiet is selective. It only amplifies what resonates with where you are, not where you've been. You may have noticed this in conversations. Someone is animated, passionate, convinced, and you're listening fully, but something inside you doesn't move. Not dismissive, not resistant, just neutral. And that neutrality feels honest. You're not pretending. You're not forcing openness. You're simply not being pulled. That's usually the moment people realize they've shifted identities without announcing it. Not a new identity, a lighter one. One that doesn't need to be reinforced by constant input. This is also why time feels different lately. Moments stretch, days feel less compressed. Not because you have more time, but because fewer things are demanding your eternal response. You're spending less energy reacting to reflections that no longer mirror you. And when energy isn't being pulled outward, it naturally settles inward. That inward settling doesn't feel mystical, it feels familiar, like returning to a room you didn't realize you'd left. And the more you rest there, the more you notice what does still reach you. Certain ideas land softly but deeply. Certain words feel like they bypass thinking entirely. Not many, just a few. And you don't chase them, you notice them. You let them pass through without gripping. That's alignment without effort. Not because you're trying to align, but because there's less friction, less contradiction between who you are and what you perceive. And when friction reduces, suffering fades, not dramatically, but practically. Not gone, just quieter. Misalignment feels obvious now, not as pain, as noise. And you naturally step away from noise. No judgment, no explanation. Just choice happening on its own. Around 10 minutes in, this is where something else usually becomes noticeable. You may realize that not everyone is meant to receive the same signals at the same time. Not hierarchically, sequentially, as if different versions of self are tuning into different layers of the same field. And you don't need to convince anyone else of where you are, because you're not there to broadcast, you're there to experience. You might even notice that when something doesn't reach you anymore, there's no impulse to correct it, no need to clarify, no desire to explain your position, because you're not positioned against anything, you're just positioned elsewhere. That's a big shift. It means identity is no longer anchored to contrast. You're not defining yourself by what you're not. You're simply inhabiting what fits, and what fits feels quiet. It feels steady. It feels unremarkable in the best way. This is also why some people feel like they're missing something lately. They sense the signal isn't landing, but assume the issue is attention, so they lean in harder, consume more, search more. But you're doing the opposite. You're leaning back, not out of avoidance, out of completion. And that's why the absence doesn't bother you. It doesn't feel like loss. It feels like space being reclaimed. Here's another gentle internal reset you might recognize. You're not waiting for the next message. You're listening to what's already integrated. And listening doesn't require effort. It requires stillness. Stillness that you didn't create. It arrived when the need to chase faded. You may have noticed this while being alone. Moments where nothing was happening, and that was enough. Not because you were numbing out, but because there was nothing unresolved demanding attention. And unresolved things always make noise. Resolved things are quiet, not silent, just settled. This is why some external voices feel like echoes now. Not wrong, just arriving late. Speaking to a version of you that already moved on, and that movement didn't require action. It was a shift in perception, a change in how identity relates to experience. You're less identified with what you perceive, more aware of the space perceiving it, not as a concept, as a lived sensation. And once that sensation stabilizes, some signals simply don't register. They're not blocked, they're just unnecessary. This doesn't mean nothing reaches you anymore. It means what reaches you does so gently, without urgency, without demand, like a quiet confirmation rather than a directive. And you don't cling to it, you let it pass. Because you trust your internal orientation more than external authority now. Not arrogantly, naturally. Authority feels unnecessary when alignment is present. This is also where collective patterns come into view. You may sense that many people are waking up quietly, individually, not in groups, not in movements, but in subtle personal shifts that don't announce themselves. People stepping out of reactive loops, out of identity reinforcement cycles, not becoming passive, becoming clear. And clarity doesn't argue, it observes, it chooses, it moves on when something no longer reflects. This is why it can feel like not everyone is receiving the same message, because not everyone is standing in the same internal place. And that's okay, it has to be that way. Different versions of self, exploring different layers of experience, all within the same field. No hierarchy, no destination, just parallel paths unfolding at their own pace. You may notice that when you think about this, there's no urge to categorize yourself. No need to label where you are, because labels belong to the past version of you that needed orientation. This version already knows where it is without naming it. Around 20 minutes in, this is where something soft but significant often settles in. You realize that the absence of certain messages isn't a loss of connection. It's a sign of internal coherence. When the inner field is coherent, it reflects less noise, less contradiction, less external prompting. And coherence feels like ease, not excitement, ease. You may even feel a slight smile internally when you notice that. Not pride, recognition, like remembering something you didn't know you'd forgotten. And you don't rush to share it, because sharing would require translating it into words that flatten it. And this doesn't want to be flattened, it wants to be lived. There's also a subtle compassion that arises here for people still searching, still leaning, still waiting for signals to arrive. Not pity, understanding. You remember that place. You went there too. And you know that no explanation would have moved you out of it faster. The shift happened when it was ready, not because of information, because of integration. And integration can't be rushed. It happens when experience settles fully, when identity relaxes its grip, when perception becomes less about meaning and more about present. That's why this feels so ordinary, so unremarkable, so easy to miss, and yet undeniable. You don't feel lost. You don't feel found. You feel here. And here doesn't need commentary. Here doesn't need confirmation. Here just is. There may be moments where you wonder what comes next. Not anxiously, curiously, and the answer doesn't arrive as a plan. It arrives as continued alignment, as choices that feel obvious when they appear, as paths that open without force. You don't chase them, you notice them. And when something doesn't open, you don't push. Because pushing feels misaligned now. It feels noisy. Effort still exists, but it's clean effort, directed, unforced, aligned with identity rather than compensating for lack. This is also where subtle references may begin to resonate, not as teachings, as mirrors. You might encounter ideas about parallel paths, or identity shifts, or perception shaping experience. And instead of analyzing them, you simply recognize yourself in them. They don't add anything. They reflect what's already happening. That's why something like Parallel Realities doesn't feel like a book to be consumed. It feels like language for something already familiar, not a guide, a mirror. And mirrors don't tell you what to do. They show you what's already there. If you notice that resonance, you don't need to act on it. Noticing is enough. That's the theme here. Nothing needs to be done. Nothing needs to be reached. This isn't a path forward. It's a settling into where you already are. And that's why the conversation doesn't end when the video does. Because it was never happening here to begin with. It was happening where you were already listening, internally, quietly, without words. You may leave this with the same sense you arrived with. Not informed, not transformed, just more settled. More at home in your own perception. More comfortable not receiving what no longer belongs. And more open to what arrives naturally, without force. There's no conclusion to draw. No takeaway to summarize, just a recognition that continues unfolding on its own, long after the sound fades, long after the words stop, because it was never about the words. It was about what didn't need to be said anymore. You may notice that even the way you listen has changed. You're not reaching forward anymore. You're letting sound come to you, and when it does, you don't grab it. You let it pass through the space you're already in. This is subtle, but it's everything, because reaching is effort. And what you're experiencing now doesn't require effort. It requires honesty. Honesty about what actually moves you. Honesty about what no longer does. There's a quiet confidence in that honesty, not the kind that needs to be defended, the kind that doesn't need reinforcement at all. You may have noticed that when something does resonate now, it feels different than it used to. It doesn't excite you. It doesn't energize you. It aligns you. It feels like something clicking into place rather than lighting up, like recognition instead of stimulation. And recognition is calm. It doesn't shout. It doesn't persuade. It just settles. This is why so many loud things feel strangely hollow now. Not offensive, not irritating, just empty of relevance. They're performing for a version of attention you no longer inhabit, and you don't feel superior for noticing that. If anything, you feel softer, more patient, less invested in being right, because being right belongs to an identity that needed contrast. This identity doesn't. It doesn't need an opposite to exist. It doesn't need resistance to feel real. It simply is. There's an interesting side effect to this. You may have noticed that silence no longer feels like waiting. It feels like presence. Earlier, silence might have felt like a pause before something important arrived. Now it feels like the important thing itself, not as an experience to chase, as a baseline. And when silence becomes a baseline, noise has to earn its place, not through volume, through resonance. This is where perception becomes the filter, not belief. You're not deciding what to accept or reject. You're noticing what naturally stays. And what stays does so without effort. That's alignment, not as a concept. As a lived reality, another gentle reorientation you may recognize here. You're no longer collecting ideas. You're inhabiting awareness. Ideas come and go. Awareness remains. And when awareness becomes primary, ideas stop feeling like answers. They feel like reflections, useful sometimes, interesting occasionally, but no longer necessary for orientation. You may also notice that identity feels lighter now, less defined, not vague, flexible. You can step into roles without becoming them. You can participate without being consumed. You can care without attaching your sense of self to outcomes. That's not detachment, that's coherence. It's the absence of internal contradiction. And when contradiction dissolves, effort follows it. Life doesn't become easy. It becomes clean choices, clean reactions, clean disengagement when something doesn't fit. And you don't explain that disengagement. You don't justify it. You just move. This is often misunderstood from the outside. People may think you've lost interest, or become passive, or withdrawn. But internally, it feels like clarity, like no longer scattering energy across reflections that don't match. You're not less alive. You're less fragmented. That distinction matters, because fragmentation is exhausting, and what you're experiencing now doesn't feel exhausting. It feels sustainable. There's room to breathe, room to feel without being overwhelmed, room to think without spiraling, room to exist without performing identity. And once you taste that, you don't rush back, not because you're avoiding, because you don't need to. This is where time begins to feel less linear, not philosophically, practically. Moments don't rush toward outcomes anymore. They stand on their own. And when moments stand on their own, the future loses its grip. You still plan, you still move, but planning doesn't define your present state. Presence does. That's a quiet revolution. One that doesn't announce itself. One that doesn't recruit. One that doesn't spread through persuasion. It spreads through recognition, through people quietly realizing they no longer need to chase coherence. They are coherent. And coherence doesn't seek confirmation. It reflects itself naturally. That reflection might show up as ease, as neutrality, as the absence of compulsive searching. And when searching ends, something interesting happens. You begin to notice what was always there, not hidden, just overshadowed by noise. This noticing doesn't feel like discovery. It feels like remembering, and remembering doesn't require effort. It simply occurs when forgetting loosens its grip. You didn't forget accidentally. Forgetting was functional. It allowed you to explore, to contrast, to experience fragmentation. And now, forgetting has served its purpose. So remembering arrives quietly, without fireworks, without announcements. Just a subtle return to internal alignment. And alignment doesn't need everyone to be in the same place. It only needs you to be where you are, fully. If you want, tell me when you're ready and I'll continue with the next block, keeping the same pacing and depth. There's something else you may have noticed, almost accidentally. You're less interested in certainty, not because you're unsure, because certainty feels unnecessary. You don't need things to be resolved anymore in order to stay grounded. Questions can stay open. Ambiguity doesn't bother you. It actually feels honest. Earlier versions of you needed answers to feel safe. This version feels safe before the answer arrives. And that changes everything. It changes how you listen, how you choose, how you move through moments that once demanded resolution. You're not suspended in indecision. You're resting in trust, not belief-based trust, but experiential trust. Trust built from noticing that when you stop forcing clarity, clarity still shows up, just not on demand. Not as something you extract from experience, as something that surfaces when identity relaxes. That relaxation didn't come from practice. It came from exhaustion, from seeing the same loops enough times to stop feeding them, from realizing that chasing meaning was keeping you from noticing what was already meaningful. And now meaning feels quieter, more personal, less performative. You don't feel the need to align with narratives anymore, even comforting ones, especially comforting ones, because comfort that depends on repetition eventually becomes dull, and you're not dull. You're awake in a different way, a way that doesn't spike, a way that doesn't announce itself, a way that doesn't require reinforcement. You may notice that when people speak in absolutes now, something in you stays still. You don't argue. You don't agree. You just notice the structure of certainty and how heavy it feels. You remember wearing that weight. You don't want it back. Not because it was wrong, because it's no longer necessary. Your sense of self isn't built on conclusions anymore. It's built on awareness. And awareness doesn't need to settle on one interpretation to function. It adapts, it reflects, it stays responsive. This is why identity feels more fluid lately. You can change your mind without destabilizing. You can update your view without losing your footing. You can let go of an idea without feeling like you're losing yourself, because yourself isn't tied to ideas the way it used to be. It's tied to perception, and perception is alive. It moves, it adjusts, it doesn't freeze. That flexibility brings a strange kind of peace, not relief, peace. Relief comes from solving a problem. Peace comes from realizing the problem was never central. It was contextual, and context shifts. You may have noticed that when something doesn't resonate now, you don't try to make it resonate. You don't translate it. You don't reinterpret it until it fits. You let it be what it is, and you move on. That's not indifference. That's respect for your internal signal. You're listening to something quieter than preference, quieter than belief. You're listening to coherence, and coherence doesn't shout. It hums. It stays consistent even when circumstances change. That's how you know it's real. Not because it's intense, because it's stable. Here's a gentle internal reset that may land right now. You don't need to decide who you are. You're already experiencing it. Identity reveals itself through what no longer requires effort, through what feels natural to maintain, through what doesn't drain you over time. And what drains you now is different than it used to be. Noise drains you. Performative certainty drains you. Constant stimulation drains you. But depth doesn't, silence doesn't, presence doesn't. Those restore you. That tells you everything you need to know. You may have also noticed that your relationship with time feels softer. Deadlines still exist. Schedules still matter. But internally, time isn't pressing against you the way it once did. You're less future-oriented, not careless, complete. When the present moment feels complete, the future loses its leverage. It stops pulling you forward with promises or threats. It becomes simply the next unfolding. And unfolding doesn't need management, it needs participation. You're participating now rather than anticipating. That shift alone changes how reality reflects back to you. Less resistance, less friction, less interpretation layered on top of experience. And when interpretation thins, experience feels more direct, less symbolic, more immediate, not dramatic, just real. This is also why some collective narratives feel strangely distant now. Not irrelevant, just not compelling. They don't hook your identity. They don't demand alignment. They pass through awareness like weather, not ignored, observed. An observation doesn't need reaction. It simply notes and moves on. You may realize that this is what alignment actually feels like. Not a high, not a breakthrough. A lack of internal argument. A sense that you're not fighting yourself anymore. And that's why even uncertainty feels safe. Because safety isn't coming from control. It's coming from coherence. You trust yourself to respond when response is needed. And until then, you're content to remain still. Not passive, poised. There's a readiness in stillness that action doesn't have. A clarity that doesn't announce itself. And once you feel that readiness, you stop rushing toward the next thing. You let it come to you, naturally. If you want, I can continue with the next block. Moving closer to the final unfolding, without closing anything, without resolving anything, just letting the awareness keep expanding quietly. There's a subtle honesty that starts to guide you now. Not a moral honesty, a sensory one. You can feel almost immediately when something is out of alignment, not wrong, just not true for you. And that feeling doesn't come with drama anymore. It arrives calmly, matter of fact, like noticing the temperature of a room and adjusting without comment. You don't analyze it. You don't debate it. You simply trust the signal. That trust didn't come from confidence. It came from repetition, from watching what happens when you ignore it and what happens when you don't. Over time, the pattern became clear. Listening costs less than resisting. And now resistance feels loud. You can sense it in your body before it becomes a thought, a tightening, a slight fatigue, whereas alignment feels spacious, even when it leads somewhere unfamiliar, especially then. This is why fear doesn't motivate you the way it used to. Fear requires a future-based identity, a version of you that needs protection, reassurance, direction. You're still practical, still aware. But fear doesn't drive your decisions. It informs them quietly and then steps aside. That's a big shift. It means choice is no longer reactive. It's responsive. And responsiveness doesn't rush. You might notice that when something important approaches now, it doesn't arrive with urgency. It arrives with clarity. A sense of course, no push, no pull, just recognition. And recognition doesn't feel like learning. It feels like remembering something you already knew how to do. This is also why effort feels different. You still apply energy, but it's precise, targeted. You don't scatter yourself across possibilities anymore. You choose what matches, and you stay there. That staying doesn't feel like commitment. It feels like rest inside movement. That's coherence again. The absence of internal contradiction. And contradiction used to be exhausting. You lived with it for so long that exhaustion felt normal. Now that it's gone, you realize how much energy was being spent just holding opposing versions of yourself together. You don't do that anymore. You don't need to. Those versions integrated, not into a single story, into a single presence. And presence doesn't argue with itself. Presence just notices. You may also notice that praise and criticism land differently now. Compliments don't inflate you. Judgment doesn't collapse you. Both pass through, not because you're detached, because your sense of self isn't anchored to reflection anymore. Reflection still exists, it just doesn't define you. You can appreciate being seen without needing to be seen to exist. That's freedom, quiet freedom, the kind that doesn't need to be defended. You don't announce it, you don't protect it, you simply live from it. There's a gentleness that comes with this toward yourself, toward others. You stop expecting people to be where you are. You stop expecting yourself to be where you were. You allow different versions to coexist in you and others without comparison, without hierarchy. That allowance feels natural now, not earned, not practiced. It emerged when control loosened. And control only loosens when trust is present. Not trust in outcomes, trust in awareness. Trust that whatever needs to be noticed will be noticed, without force, without chasing. You may find that your curiosity has changed shape. You're still curious, but not hungry. Curiosity without hunger feels playful, open. It explores without needing to extract value, without turning experience into content or conclusions. You're experiencing for the sake of experiencing, and that's when experience deepens, not when it's analyzed, when it's allowed. This is also why some paths simply stop appealing, not because they're closed, because they're complete. You don't need to finish them. They finished you. They gave you what they had to give, and now your attention naturally moves elsewhere. That movement doesn't feel like leaving. It feels like continuity, like walking forward without looking back, not because the past was bad, but because it's integrated. You're carrying it with you. No need to revisit. No need to repeat. And repetition is usually what searching looks like. Repeating the same question in different forms. You're not doing that anymore. The question dissolved. Not answered, dissolved. That's important. Answers close loops. Dissolution removes the loop entirely, and when loops disappear, time opens up. Not more hours, more presence, more depth in the same moments. That depth is quiet, unimpressive, easy to miss. But once you feel it, you know it's real, because it doesn't demand attention, it simply remains. Here's a final gentle reorientation that may settle now. You're not arriving somewhere new. You're staying where you already are, without leaving yourself, and staying doesn't mean stagnation. It means movement without fragmentation, change without loss, expansion without effort. This awareness doesn't end. It doesn't peak. It continues unfolding in small, ordinary moments. In how you listen, in how you choose, and how you rest inside your own perception. There's nothing to conclude here, nothing to resolve. Just a quiet sense that something important has already happened and life is now catching up to it. The conversation doesn't stop. It simply moves inward, and you'll notice it again, later, in a moment that feels ordinary, until it doesn't.